Let's go. Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Happy, yeah, that probably help. I mean, we have a packed house today. Everybody, you up, get going, get moving. How's everybody doing? It is Wednesday, October 5th. I hope y'all are having a great day, great week, great morning. Today, we are going to talk, our topics have been a lot about back to basics, talking about just different things that you can do to stay on track. Uh, Today, I'm going to talk about some contract terms, though. This Wednesday is labeled as a Wisdom Wednesday. I like to talk about attitude, intentions, energy, taking different steps. I like to talk about those things, but also sometimes we have to expand on some of the contract terms. We talked a little bit about some yesterday: force majeure, risk of loss, some of the terms there. We had a lot of questions about what people do need. Do you need extensions? Do you need certain things? So I'm going to talk to you about some of the points of the contract. There are parts of the contract that do not require an extension. It says in the contract, this contract shall be extended. And when it says that, it says the contract is going to extend no matter what. You don't need to get an addendum. You don't need any other documentation to prove that extension. And they do this in these places. There's three main places where it will automatically extend. The buyer and seller don't have to do anything. The buyer can't cancel. The seller can't cancel. It automatically will extend. The buyer can't say no. The seller can't say no. Automatically happens. And we're going to discuss those today in some of the scenarios. There's some other terms of the contract that we want to expand on just because of the situations we've been dealing with the force majeure. We haven't had a lot of those circumstances, but they are going to come up. We are going to see some more of those things. What does the seller have to do? What can a buyer do? What are the buyer's rights? What are the seller's rights? So we're going to talk about some of those things today. Also, if we have a little bit of time, we'll expand a little bit more on getting back to basics. It is the fourth quarter. Everybody give me a cheer. Give me some hand clap. It's the fourth quarter. That means we have that means we have the next 60 days to do as much business as we can to get it in by the end of the year. I know a lot of you like to shoot for your goals, meaning for the Century 21 awards, your Masters Award, Centurion Award, Diamond Awards. So we like to shoot for those. So you got the next 60 days to really write as much as you can to get as close to that as you can. The awards numbers, more than likely for next year, are probably going to go up again. Century 21 bases their criteria on what the average price point in the market is, what the across the nation, what the average sale price is, the number of units. So it's based on, if you do at least this number, you'll be Masters, at least this number, you're Masters, Ruby, Emerald, or Diamond, at least this number, then you'll be Centurion, or this many units. Because we've had some banner years over the last year and a half, 2 years, those numbers are probably going to go up. So we might as well start planning now to start putting our best foot forward, so that even if we're not quite to where you wanted to be for the fourth quarter, we're starting off the first of the year with a bang and keeping those things moving. This market is ever changing and very fluid. The market is very, very fluid. Interest rates are changing, buyer needs are changing, sellers are changing, listings are changing. Some are still selling, some are not selling it. I mean, it's just a constantly changing thing, and we have to stay abreast of all of these changes. So let's jump in, and I'm going to start off with just a couple of housekeeping things. So in our meeting yesterday, we talked about I mentioned we talked about gratitude, things to be grateful for. There's a lot of people that are in way worse situations than we are. So what we would like to do is do what we can to provide some aid, provide some help. Century 21 has a link. Jody Meyer sent it out. I believe Craig forwarded it out yesterday. If not, we'll forward it out today. There's a link that if you would like to donate, if you're someone who just says, look, I just want to be able to give where I can and I'm going to donate some funds, you can do that. In our office in the South Shore area, Apollo Beach and Sun City, we're going to do a trunk or treat event at the end of this month. And what we're doing is putting together a flyer for it. And we're going to make this a dual purpose. So we're going to raise some hurricane relief. So we're going to ask people for donations. We'll put together a list of things that we can use donations as far as like water, supplies, water, paper towels, baby wipes, food, gas cards, things like that. Those are the things that people really need right now. We're going to get a list of all of those things that are going to be best used, and we'll put that together. And on the October 28th, we're going to do a trunk or treat event in the parking lot here. All the offices are welcome to come. We'd like to really kind of expand it and get people really involved. We're going to take donations between now and the end of through the end of this month, and then make a trip at the end of the month. We've got a couple other people I know over here. The Salty Shamrock has been making trips down regularly. They've got contractors that they've been working with. They're filling up moving trucks and trailers and making trips regularly. So if we get too much, we'll just partner with them and get some things going down before that. But we just want to be able to help out where we can. For all of you who are interested, we'll get some more information out. And if you want to be a part of that, reach out to me directly, and we'll get you some information right away, but we'll start sharing some more from that. The November 3rd through the 6th, we have the Tony Robbins Unleash the Power Within. We've got 3 available tickets. So we have some people that could not go, and we have some available tickets for those of you who would like to go. I personally have one, and if it doesn't go, if I don't get anyone that would like to purchase it, I'm considering doing like some type of contest or a raffle. And I just think that whenever you pay for something, you deem it more valuable. So people who pay for coaching end up showing up to the coaching. People who pay for the coaching get more out of the coaching than the ones who get it for free. Whenever you're offered free coaching, an event like this, whenever you get something given to you and you don't actually pay for it, it doesn't carry the same kind of value. Look at everything in your life. If something that you buy, if you buy a shirt for $5, is it more or less valuable than the one you paid $150 for? If you paid $5 for a shirt, is it more or less valuable than one you paid $150 for? Even if it was basic, you could probably not even know the difference. Same exact thing, but I paid $150 for this one, paid $5 for this one. The one you paid $5 for is going to be deemed less valuable just because it was. So that's just how it typically always works. So but I also want, completely subjective, but I also want people to have an opportunity. If you want to go to an Unleash the Power Within event, you'll have this opportunity. Like I said, we've got 3 tickets. The event's sold out. You can only buy tickets to a secondary room that's broadcast via a Zoom and a screen in that room, not in the main room. So if you want to go to that, let me know. I'll get you in contact with the people who have the tickets. All right, so let's jump into our contracts. Like I said, there are 3 places in this FAR/BAR contract that automatically extend the contract without anything having to happen. Buyer doesn't have to agree, seller doesn't have to agree. These are 3 places that it will automatically extend if something happens. And what I would like you to do is, if you know where any of those are, chat it in. If you know what any one of those 3 places in this contract are, just chat one of them. You don't have to do all 3. You don't have to be a show off and tell me you know all of them. What are the 3 reasons that a contract would automatically extend without a buyer or seller having to say, we need to extend this contract? Go ahead and put it in the chat and tell me where those are in here. So throw it in the chat for me, please, and let me know where any one of those 3 places this contract automatically extends are. We have the audience counting on their fingers. This one, that one, and go over there. I think it was here. Go ahead. No. So tell me where those are if you have them. Force majeure, that is one of them, correct? Jesse, title, correct. That's one. What is the 3rd place this contract shall, the contract says, shall extend without having? So force majeure, title, and CBD, BBD, the CD, the closing disclosure. So the three areas of this contract that will automatically extend, and we'll look at each one of them individually: the closing disclosure, force majeure, and title. These are automatic extensions if something happens. We're going to poll the audience. So where it's an automatic extension, if something happens, it says, if this happens, this contract automatically extends. You, Mr. Buyer, don't have to do that. You, Mr. Seller, don't have to say anything. You, Mr. Seller, can't say no, and you, Mr. Buyer, can't say no. It automatically happens. And we are bound by the terms of this contract. So let's look at those individually. First, the 2 of them are mentioned right here. This says right here, it's actually the paragraph 5 extension of the closing date. It says in the event closing funds from buyer's lender are not available on the closing date due to Consumer Financial Protection Bureau closing disclosure delivery requirements, the CFPB requirements. If paragraph 8B is checked, if there's a loan, if this is contingent on a contract having a loan, then the closing date shall be extended for such a period necessary to satisfy the CFPB requirements, provided such period shall not exceed 7 days. This used to say 10 days. Now it says 7. So if you didn't catch that, it says not to exceed 7 days. And the operative words here, this then closing date shall be extended. Doesn't say that the buyer has to notify the seller that we need an extension. It doesn't say the seller can say, sorry, we have a closing date, you have to hit it. This says in the contract that the buyer and seller agreed to, the closing date shall be extended. The buyer and the seller already agreed to this extension when they signed this contract. Now, when we talk about the CFPB requirements and the closing disclosure delivery, now that's a whole nother animal. That is not clarified in here. What constitutes that? It doesn't say that your buyer is not cleared to close, still waiting on documents. The lender just hasn't issued the CD. The lender hasn't issued the CD. Well, they can't issue the CD because they haven't even completed the file yet. They don't even have the documents and information they need to create a CD to be able to start balancing with title to issue one. So there's no way they could. It doesn't say and clarify. It doesn't say in our opinion and what attorney's opinion are. These are just opinions because it's not clear. And what the lender's opinion is such that the buyer has delivered all their documents. The file has got to the clear to close point. We have a closing date of Friday. Today's Wednesday. We just got clear to close and we're balancing a CD today. I'm going to issue the CD by the end of the day today. Today's Wednesday. I'll issue it today. That will trigger an automatic extension. Because the minute you issue the CD, we have to wait 3 days. If you haven't issued the CD yet, how do we know if the CFPB requirements are being triggered? They just haven't issued the CD. When the minute I issue the CD, it says now we have to wait 3 days, right? But this is not absolutely abundantly clear in here how it's spelled out. So the minute that the lender issues the CD, we have a CFPB requirement of a 3-day wait before we can close. I know I'm not trying to beat dead horses. We've talked about this to some extent, but I want to cover all of these areas where the closing shall automatically extend. And it says it shall extend for a period necessary to satisfy those requirements such that it shall not exceed 7 days. It doesn't automatically extend 7 days. It says, so it shall not exceed 7 days. So if you only need 3 days, you're only going to get a 3-day extension. If you issue a CD now and the buyer acknowledges it, and then all of a sudden the closing numbers change the day of closing, you have to issue another CD potentially. And that could trigger it again to extend another 3 days, but not to exceed 7. So at that point, you have extended 6 days, not to exceed 7. Well, what happens if it has to extend past 7 because they didn't get their crap together? You're not saying it. You're not saying anything.
Well, I also look at the loan approval has been obtained and lender's underwriting is complete. So
Where does it say
there's
that?
line 57,
Mhm.
58. So on line 58, it says that if that's been sent out and loan approval has been obtained and the lender's underwriting is complete, then the closing date shall be extended. So if,
Mhm.
yes, there's could be some things that they have to send in like the day before closing and stuff like that. But if we don't have a loan approval, which if we're past the loan approval period, it's already deemed that it's done, or we already have that approval taken care of and underwriting is complete, then, I mean, technically we shouldn't have as many hiccups, but there's always things that could pop up that they
So-
might have to get taken care
Yeah.
of.
So if something pops up and you need more than 7 days, if it exceeds the 7-day point
Yep.
for some reason whatsoever, This contract only extends to 7 days. Now you need the buyer and seller to agree to extend past that.
Yep.
After 7, either party has option to cancel. Where does it say that, John? Where does it say after 7 days, either party has the option to cancel? That's what I mean. It doesn't spell out every single little thing, but it does spell out that there is an automatic extension. Now, here's where people, all right, we're going to need to get a closing. We're going to need a closing date extension. I need you to send that over. It says up to 7 days, but it doesn't say who has the right to cancel after that. It doesn't say the buyer can cancel. It doesn't say the seller can cancel. It just says this shall be extended up to 7 days. So then there's other terms that would come in after that 7 days. If the closing date has already passed and you get to that 7 day point and the closing date passes, you don't have a contract anymore because the closing date is gone. The terms of this contract are not in full force anymore because you extended up until the 7 days. That extended the contract. Closing date passes. Your contract is no longer in effect because the contract started the day they signed and it ends and expires the day of closing. And if somebody doesn't perform and you don't close by the day of closing, this would extend till the 7 days. Your contract is no longer in full force. So you don't need a cancellation because the contract doesn't exist anymore. That's right. You're out of contract. So there's a lot of little things that can happen here. So that's one of them. Another one, it mentions it here, but it doesn't talk about the terms. In an event constituting force majeure, causes services essential for closing to be unavailable, including unavailability of utilities or insurance of hazard, wind, flood, or homeowners insurance, closing date shall be extended as provided in Standard G. So let's go look at Standard G. Line 439 to 452. If that above scenario and the seller claims the escrow, now what? Depends. What did the rest of the contract say? Because at that point, we have to go back and look at what was the buyer's loan. But this is talking about the loan approval. If there is a loan approval period of 30 days and you get to 30 days and you have say you have a closing on day 31, at 30 days, the buyer gets their closing disclosure issued to them. We extend 3 days because you can't close the 31st day. You have to go out to make sure that the CFP requirements are met. If you get to that point and you have not extended your loan approval, but it says, sorry, let's go back. If paragraph 8B is checked, loan approval is obtained, and underwriting is complete, the closing date shall extend. So if loan approval has been obtained, you are waiving your loan approval. So your buyer has no more loan approval protection. So this only comes into play if the loan approval has been obtained. But I've seen lenders and buyer's agents try to use this clause to get an extension when they haven't even issued the CD yet because they don't have loan approval. They don't have any of that. So you just have to be dealing. So at that point, the buyer wouldn't have any more protection for their loan approval period. And if they don't close, their money would be at risk. So anybody can make a claim on the deposit at any time, and it's going to come back to the terms of the contract. So let's go to force majeure 439 to 452. I know we talked about this yesterday, so we don't want to harp on it too much, but buyer and seller should not be required to exercise or perform any right or obligation under the contract or be liable to each other for damages, so long as performance or non-performance of the right or obligation or the availability of services, insurance, or required approvals essential to closing is disrupted, delayed, caused, or prevented by a force majeure event. Force majeure means hurricanes, flood, extreme weather, earthquakes, fires, or other acts of God, unusual transportation delays, wars, insurrections, civil unrest, or acts of terrorism, governmental actions and mandates, government shutdowns, epidemics, or pandemics, which by exercise of reasonable, diligent effort, the non-performing party is unable in whole or in part to prevent or overcome. The force majeure event will be deemed to have begun on the first day the effect of the force majeure prevents performance, non-performance, or availability of services, insurance, or required approvals essential to closing. All time periods affected by the force majeure event, including closing date, will be extended a reasonable time up to 7 days after the force majeure event no longer prevents performance under this contract, provided, however, if such force majeure event continues to prevent performance under this contract for more than 30 days beyond the closing date, then either party may terminate this contract by delivering written notice to other, and the deposit shall be refunded to the buyer, thereby releasing buyer and seller of all further obligations under this contract. What does that mean? It means if something comes in and happens, that the closing shall automatically be extended. The performance dates shall automatically be extended for such a period of time up to 7 days after the break in the force majeure no longer exists. So force majeure happens, performance ability kicks back in, things are restored. You have up to 7 days after things are restored to make your performance. Whether it was your inspections, whether it was closing, whether it was loan approval, you have up to 7 days. That's what it says. Doesn't matter if the closing date comes and goes, this automatically extends all of the performance dates of the contract for up to that period of 7 days after the force majeure no longer exists or prevents people from performing. Unless the force majeure continues for more than 30 days. If people cannot perform for more than 30 days, at that point, the buyer or the seller may terminate this contract. You don't need the buyer's permission to cancel as a seller. You don't need the seller's permission to cancel as a buyer. It says either party may terminate this contract by delivering written notice, and deposit will be returned to the buyer. We're probably going to see a lot of that down in the South in Fort Myers, Cape Coral. If anybody had a contract on any property that is no longer there, that just means the buyer cannot force the seller to have to rebuild the home that was there within a specific period of time. They can't make them do anything specific. There's no specific performance they're going to be able to force them to. After 30 days, you obviously aren't going to be building a home back in 30 days. After 30 days, if the seller, because of all the devastation and everything they've been through, if they no longer want to continue on with that, they just have the right to cancel it and then tend to their properties, tend to their things. What if we need reinspection past 7 days? We'll talk about that. So that's just the same thing. And then the seller can't say, no, it's going to take me 6 months, but I'm going to restore all of this and you're going to buy it in 6 months. You can't force a buyer to do that either. If the buyer wants to cancel, the buyer has the ability to cancel. So if you need a reinspection past the 7 days, this contract says once things are restored, they feel it's reasonable to perform within 7 days. Once everything's been restored, it's reasonable to perform within 7 days. If there's other reasons outside of that, those become negotiations. And if you need if you can't get a reinspection within the 7 days, is it because the seller has not been able to perform something for you? Then obviously, if the seller's not able to perform and not able to get something ready for you to reinspect, then you should have a reasonable time to reinspect that. And that's going to be a negotiation between you and the seller's agent, you and the buyer's agent. But you should be able to do whatever you need to do within that 7-day period. And if not, then other terms of this contract will be in play. So if you force majeure exists and you had an inspection period that was up on Friday and this past Friday, your inspection period will extend to, like, if the force majeure existed, let's say things get restored today, we'll have 7 days to inspect the property. And if we get out there to inspect the property, you're obviously going to find damages, problems, issues with the property if the seller hasn't been able to fix them, right? You're still within your inspection period. The terms of the contract will prevail at that point. You have an as-is inspection period, or there's certain things that will need to be fixed up to a certain point. Those terms will start to kick in. Reinspection, closing new CD, all in 7 days. It says that it gives you a reasonable period of time for when it starts that you should be able to do that. If it's not reasonable because of whatever circumstances, then you're going to have to negotiate. But this is what the contract automatically does. If you need more time than that, then it's up for negotiations. And if all parties are reasonable, it shouldn't be a problem. So let's talk the next one, the next reason, or no, we'll go to, since we're on this, we'll continue on to the risk of loss. And we talked briefly about this yesterday. I'm not going to harp on it too much again, but this is basically if after the effective date, but before closing, property is damaged by fire or other casualty loss and cost of restoration, which shall include cost of pruning or removing damaged trees, does not exceed 1.5% of the purchase price. Cost of restoration shall be an obligation of seller, and closing shall proceed pursuant to the terms of this contract. If restoration is not completed as of the closing date, that does not give, sidebar, it does not give the seller the right to say, sorry, I couldn't do it, so I'm not going to be able to meet the terms of this contract, so we can cancel this contract. Because we've had sellers try to do that. It's just too much. There's no way I'm going to be able to do it. Can't make it, can't get it done. Sorry, I'm just not going to be able to do that. Cancel this contract. No, it says if it cannot be completed as of closing, a sum equal to 125% of the estimated cost to complete the restoration that doesn't exceed 1.5% of the purchase price. We have a purchase price of $500,000. What's 1.5% of $500,000? $7,500. $7,500. So if you have a purchase price of $500,000, there is damage to something on the property and the cost is going to be $5,000. They have estimates. The seller just wasn't able to do it. You are going to have to put into escrow 125% of the $5,000 into escrow because it didn't exceed 1.5%. What's 125% of $5,000? No, no? So what's $5,000 times 25%? Wait, no chats. All right. So you're looking at about, let's just make it easy for it's about $6,400. Or about, 63, right around there, $6,300. So you would escrow $6,300 if the estimates to repair were 5,000. That would go into escrow. The contract would close. Buyer and seller would close on the deal. They would take $6,300 and put it into an escrow account. The repairs would be completed. Documentation would be provided to the title company. Here's the cost. Here's what it was. Here's what it actually was, because they had to do this, 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 and this. It was estimated 5,000. Repairs were actually 6 by the time it was all done. They will pay the $6,000. The seller will get the $300 that was left over back. If the cost exceeds the 6,300 that was in the 125% that was in escrow, if it exceeds that, it says the seller will pay the difference. They will pay the actual cost, but not to exceed 1.5%. So in this instance, the actual cost, let's say you had a $5,000 estimate. It's a $500,000 purchase price. 1.5% is $7,500. The $5,000 estimate was not sufficient. They came out and found many more problems. Now it's going to be $10,000. The buyer is closed on the property. They already own the property. There's $7,500 in escrow. It says the seller is not obligated to pay more than 1.5%. So he's going to pay the $7,500 out of escrow, and the buyer is responsible for the other $2,500 to meet the $10,000 for those repairs. Any unused portion of escrow amount shall be returned to the seller, like we just talked about. If cost of restoration exceeds 1.5% of the purchase price, buyer shall elect to either take property as is together with 1.5% or receive a refund of the deposit, thereby releasing buyer and seller of any further obligations under this contract. Seller's sole obligation with respect to tree damage by casualty, loss, or other natural occurrence shall be cost of pruning or removal, not replacement. They don't have to replace trees that fell. We had a lot of trees that fell. The seller doesn't have to put them up. They just have to take them down. So there's two of them. We have force majeure and the CD. What is the third place that the contract will automatically extend? Title. Under our title evidence section, the buyer shall get a title commitment if there is a loan 15 days prior to closing, if left blank. If there is not a loan and it's cash, 5 days prior to closing, they will receive title commitment and be able to review the title commitment. Here's what the title commitment covers. I'm not going to read through all of that. But here's what happens and how the contract could automatically extend without the buyer having to extend and the seller having to extend. You just have to deliver written notice that you found a defect and you want it fixed. Buyer shall have 5 days after receipt of title commitment to examine and notify seller in writing, specifying defects, if any, that render the title unmarketable. What would render it unmarketable? It spells it out up here in this section. It tells what is going to be included. If the seller provides title commitment and it is delivered to buyer less than 5 days prior to closing, buyer may extend closing for up to 5 days after date of receipt to examine same in accordance with this standard A. The box is typically checked that if you have a loan, it's title commitment delivered 15 days prior to closing. If you don't get it 15 days prior to closing and you get it 5 days prior to closing, the buyer has the ability to extend it up to 5 days. If you don't get it until the closing date, the buyer has the ability to extend it up to 5 days to review. The buyer shall have 5 days to review the title commitment, no matter when he receives it, if it has not been delivered to him. Seller shall have 30 days, the cure period, after receipt of buyer's notice to take reasonable, diligent efforts to remove defects. If buyer fails to so notify seller, buyer shall be deemed to have accepted title as it then is. So buyer has to review title within 5 days of receiving the title commitment. If there are any defects, must notify the seller in writing. Notify them in writing that there are defects that they would like cured. If they notify them, the buyer, if they notify the seller shall cure defects within the cure period. They'll have 30 days. It doesn't say, it says right here, seller shall have 30 days to cure the defect. If you have a closing in 4 days, 5 days from now, the seller has 30 days to cure it. They don't have 4 days to cure it. They have 30 days. And it doesn't say the buyer can cancel. It says, buyer, you have to notify the seller and the seller has 30 days to fix the problem. You are stuck in this contract while the seller tries to fix that problem and use diligent effort to do so. If the seller cures within the cure period, seller shall deliver written notice to buyer with proof of cure acceptable to buyer and buyer's attorney, and the parties will close this contract on the closing date. If the closing date is passed, then within 10 days of buyer's receipt of seller's notice, the closing shall occur. So the seller has 30 days to cure. I know, let's say we get title commitment and it was late in the game. I got it 5 days prior to closing. I'm going to notify the seller when I have 5 days to review it. I tell them on the first day I get it, hey, there's a problem and I need you to fix this. You have your 30 days. The closing date is in 5 days. If the seller can't fix it in 5 days, it says right here, we will close within 10 days after buyer's receipt of notice that the seller has cured the defect within that cure period. If the seller doesn't fix it until day 30, he had 30 days to cure, we will close within 10 days of the seller notifying me, the buyer, that he cured the defect and is acceptable. Okay? So you could potentially have a 40-day closing if the seller is able to cure, 40-day extension, because the seller will have 30 days to cure it. If he doesn't cure it till the 30th day, it's an extension of 10 days after that you can have within 10 days. If the seller is unable to cure the defects, then buyer may, within 5 days of the expiration of the cure period, deliver written notice to seller, extending the cure period for up to 120 days. Within that time, the seller will use reasonable, diligent effort to remove or cure the defects. Or the buyer can accept title as it is and close on the closing date, or if the closing date passed within 10 days of that, or they may cancel this contract and receive a refund. It doesn't say the seller can cancel. The seller can't just say, I don't want to go through that and deal with that. Doesn't say that. The seller has to make reasonable, diligent effort to cure within the cure period. If they can't cure within the cure period, that 30 days, the buyer has the option of what to do. Mr. Seller, I'm going to stick with this contract and I'm going to extend this 120 days. Buyer may, within 5 days after the expiration of the 30-day cure period, notify the seller in writing of what they want. We will extend this contract for up to 120 days to allow you to continue to use diligent effort to fix that and extend it. Or the buyer can accept it as it is. They can extend the cure period up to 120 days and still decide to accept it as is after that period, and it'll close within 10 days after the extended cure period or the receipt of notice. Or they can terminate the contract and get their deposit back and release everybody. If after reasonable diligent effort, seller is unable to timely cure defects and buyer does not waive the defects, this contract shall terminate. So after the 120 days, we have a 30-day cure period. Seller couldn't do it. Buyer says, I want to give him more time. I'm going to stick with this contract. He can't cancel me. I want 120 days. I'll give you the 120 days per this contract that it says. I'm going to deliver written notice to you that I will extend this to 120 days because that's my option. After that 120 days, if the seller has used diligent effort to cure this defect and has not been able to, this contract automatically terminates. No notice is required. Buyer doesn't have to deliver notice. Seller doesn't have to deliver notice. It says, if after reasonable, diligent effort, seller is unable to timely cure defects and buyer does not waive the defects, this contract shall terminate. No more contract. So these are the places, because we've had a lot of questions. Well, we need an extension. Technically, we don't. Contract already extends it. It says what's supposed to happen. The contract, this is in writing. The buyer and seller already agreed to these terms and agreed to extend it for up to these timelines per this contract. We don't need to put it in writing again that we are extending it up to these timelines because the contract said so. It already says it. You don't need it. What's wrong with getting absolute clarity and having a buyer and seller put it in writing? Nothing. You can get an extension and put it in writing and say, we are going, because it says within 10 days, we will close. Within 120 days, we'll notify you. You can put it in writing if you want, just for absolute clarity, and all parties say, hey, I just want to make sure that we're abundantly clear that this is what the contract says. This is what we're doing. This is the date we're going to do it on because it says we had to do it within this period, but we'll do it before. You can do those things. You can put it in writing, but you don't need it. It automatically extends. Let's see, what else do we... Let's talk about property maintenance. Lines 257 to 259. So these are some other little things because our force majeure enactments for this contract are not major. There's not a lot of problems, but there might be some minor property maintenance issues. Force majeure does take precedence, but there are some other things that might come up. Except for ordinary wear and tear and casualty loss, because we talked about risk of loss. That's where the casualty loss comes in. So without any of those, just simple maintenance things, seller shall maintain the property, including but not limited to lawn, shrubbery, pool, and condition existing as of the effective date. Notice it says lawn, shrubbery, and pool. So we really didn't have a lot of the force majeure issues. But let's just say just simple maintenance. Let's just say it was a windstorm. It was just a major windstorm. There's branches, there's things, there's all that stuff down. Nothing was lost. There was no inability to perform. The seller has to maintain the property in that condition. They have to maintain the lawn. They have to maintain the shrubbery and the pool. So if shrubbery this is not a place where it says the risk of loss and casualty loss says they only have to prune and remove trees. If something happens to a tree here, if there was no risk of loss or casualty loss, something just happened, say somebody ran over a tree or ran over some shrubs, they've got to replace those. They can't just stop mowing the lawn. They can't stop maintaining the lawn. If half the lawn dies, they're responsible for it. Your buyer doesn't have to close because it says they have to maintain it in the condition it was as of effective date. So we also we've got two. Well, we talked about seller won't sign an extension. They don't need to in certain instances because it's already covered. But we have an issue where the seller wants to cancel. So I wanted to talk about that. This doesn't appear to be force majeure related. This doesn't appear to be anything related. We are not getting all of the information. We have a buyer under contract and the seller says, it's in my best interest to cancel this contract. And I'm willing to give you your money back. I'm willing to give you any money you spent back. I'm willing to pay you damages and I'm willing to pay your agent commissions. But it's in my best interest that I can't sell this property right now. What do? What happens when that happens? You have a legally binding contract that says the buyer has the right to sell and the seller has the buyer has the right to buy and the seller has the obligation to sell. What do? Well, no, you're going to sell me this house. You can't force someone to sell a property. You can't force a seller to show up at closing and sign documents if they're not wanting to or not willing to or just won't do it. You can't force them. But that's why we have contracts. Contracts are enforceable. So what do? Seller's not going to sell anymore. What do? You either accept the offer or let a lawyer sue for specific performance. Correct. Your buyer has options. Your buyer can accept the seller's offer and say, you know what, I don't want to go through the hassle. Now, we don't know exactly what's going on, so the seller might still end up selling. He just said, it's in my best interest to not. I want to do this so we can cancel this contract. If the buyer says, no, I still want the home, so I'm going to keep moving forward with everything. What happens if the buyer keeps moving forward with everything, doesn't agree to cancel the contract because they don't have to, and now the buyer needs an extension for loan approval or something, or closing? Seller doesn't have to grant it. The seller doesn't have to give them those extensions. And the seller could say, sorry, oh, and by the way, your loan approval period was up and you need an extension for the closing date and your escrow's at risk. I offered to give you the escrow back and pay you this and pay. You didn't take it. You took a chance. So you get nothing now. And we're canceling this contract because I'm not going to extend it. The rights and obligations expire the day of the closing date and you can't close. That could happen. What if the buyer says, I want to take this chance. I want to buy the home. Tell them I want to buy the home and they keep working forward. They get everything done. The buyer shows up on the closing date, wires their funds, does everything, and the seller doesn't show up. Then what? Well, now you have a breach of contract. If the seller doesn't show up to close, the seller didn't perform according to the terms of the contract. What are your buyer's rights? Contract gives them the right to buy and the seller the obligation to sell. If the seller doesn't meet one of those terms, the seller is in default. Well, where is the seller default section? $345, seller default. If for any reason other than failure of seller to make seller's title marketable after reasonable diligent effort, seller fails, neglects, or refuses to perform seller's obligations under this contract, Buyer may elect to receive return of buyer's deposit without waiving any action for damages resulting from seller's breach, and pursuant to paragraph 16 may seek to recover such damages or seek specific performance. This paragraph shall survive closing or termination of this contract. So this says that just because you guys terminate a contract or close, it doesn't mean that the buyer waived any rights to damages. So this just says what are the buyer's rights? He can seek specific performance or damages. How do you do that? Get an attorney, file a suit, sue for specific performance. If this is a person's primary residence that they live in, do you think a judge is going to kick someone out of their primary residence, their primary homestead residence, if they don't have any place else to go or something happened and he just didn't perform according to the contract? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But how long is this process going to take if the buyer gets to this point and says, no, I'm suing? How long is it going to take? A long time. It's not going to happen in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks. It's not like you're going to put it in front of a judge. See, I told you he didn't do what he was supposed to do. You're right. You get to close, you get the home. Go ahead. Happy moving day. 2 weeks later. It's going to be minimum probably 6 months before anybody sees anything. Probably a couple of years before it really gets in front of anybody. The whole time the seller can't sell the home, and the whole time the buyer is going to have to be going through and jumping through hoops. They're probably not buying another home anyway. And if they're seeking damages, how were you damaged? You were able to buy another home 2 weeks later and moved into that one. How were you damaged? You just didn't get that one, the one that you wanted? It might be some minor stuff, but the seller already offered to pay you damages earlier on and told you they weren't going to do it. They said, I will pay you your escrow. I will pay you what you spent, and I will pay you damages. You let me know what you think those damages are, and I'll pay the commissions. Huh. He already offered that? I'm not an attorney or a judge, but it just doesn't seem like it would end very well for the buyer or the seller, even though the seller is the one who didn't perform. So it's up to the buyer. Buyer, make sure they understand all their rights. Mr. Buyer, there's another part of this contract that says, don't rely on me for legal advice. So I definitely recommend you talk to an attorney about what your rights are and what they can do. And I'm sure an attorney's going to get all bright eyed and be like, ooh, we got a lot to work with here. So it's completely up to the buyer what he would like to do. So here's a question. I know a situation where a real estate agent listed a home, put it under contract, did not disclose personal interest, and then he and his wife reconciled. So he decided to cancel the contract and not return anything but the deposit 2 days before closing. How do you think that one will play out? Wow. So there's a lot to unravel there, and unfortunately only judges and attorneys will be able to figure that one out. So they decided to cancel the contract and not return anything but the deposit. I'm not going to close. The buyer agreed to cancel the contract and get their deposit back because they didn't want to mess with all of that, but they did not waive their right to seek damages. They still have that right if they got their escrow back. So here's what we talk about. If the property is in MLS and the property is, if the property is put into an MLS, then there's a guarantee of compensation. Commission is earned at the time of contract, not at the time of closing. So the seller, who's a real estate agent, if they weren't an agent and a seller, they would potentially owe 2 commissions, to a listing brokerage and a buyer's brokerage, because our commission is earned. You put a property on the market and said, here, I'm putting it on MLS. I'm offering you compensation if you bring me a buyer ready, willing, and able to contract on this property, who's ready, willing, and able to close. I brought you the buyer ready, willing, able to contract and to close on the property. Your seller backed out. I'm still due commission. So are you, Mr. Broker. So we would have to go after the listing brokerage for our commission. So we would have to go there, go to the listing broker and say, we want our commission. The listing broker then has to go after the seller for their commission. So that there alone is sometimes enough to get a seller to rethink their position of not selling. Because if you have a $700,000 home at 6% commission, that's $42,000 they have to pay to not sell their home. On top of that, they have to give the escrow deposit back. On top of that, they're probably going to have to hire an attorney if the buyer sues them. On top of that, there's probably going to be some damages they have to reimburse the buyer for and costs out of pocket. So between all of that, I mean, just those costs alone, you're looking at probably, $50,000 straight of, for a $700,000 home, $50,000 right away. And some sellers, not a lot of people have 50 grand to just offer someone money and pay money out when they're not selling their home. So the fact that he's a real estate agent, we are held to a higher standard. We are supposed to have more information and knowledge than the public. There is an addendum in the Florida Realtors forms that is the addendum AA, licensee's disclosure of personal interest in property. If there's an addendum and that connects to the contract and we have that situation, we should be using the addendum, and he, being a real estate agent selling the home, has more knowledge than the public and should know to put that addendum into the contract. The fact that he didn't include the addendum and was an agent and has greater knowledge is probably going to be, in my opinion, I'm not an attorney, going to be an issue for him. He should have disclosed that. Should have been put out. Just the same reason that if we have a whole sale of buyer's property and we don't use the sale of buyer's property contingency, we just say, oh, well, he's got loan approval period. That's not really using diligent effort and good faith when we know there's a sale of a property, there's an addendum for it, and we didn't use it. I don't think that that's the right thing. So I think he should lose his license, though. That's for the board. That's not something that would be for FREC, the Florida Real Estate Commission. Completely unprofessional. Absolutely. What's worse is the buyer is the one who noticed his last name was the same and asked if he was related to the owner, if it was his house. Correct. Yeah. And that's what we're always trying to avoid with disclosures. If I had known this, I would have done that differently. Let's go to, let's talk about walkthroughs. So we're getting a lot of questions about these, about walkthroughs. Line 275, walkthrough inspection and reinspection. What is the buyer's right for access to the property? Can the buyer go to the property whenever he wants? Does he have access to the property whenever they want? Can they come and go as they please? If it's a vacant home, does that make it different? Can they just show up with their agent? Well, it was vacant, so we thought we'd come by. Now, the buyer has their inspection period in which to perform any and all inspections that they deem necessary. So it's reasonable. With reasonable access to the property, the seller shouldn't be denying them access, but it has to be reasonable too. On the day prior to closing date, so through a walkthrough inspection, on the day prior to closing date or on the closing date prior to the time of closing, as specified by the buyer or buyer's representative may perform a walkthrough and follow-up walkthrough if necessary, inspection of the property solely to confirm that all items of personal property are on the property and to verify the seller has maintained the property as required by the as-is maintenance requirement, has met all other contractual obligations. So we have some issues with this sometimes. Buyer wants to do their walkthrough the day before closing. Seller says, no, can't do it. Who's right? What's the contract say? On the day prior to closing or on the closing date prior to the time as specified by the buyer. As specified by the buyer. Buyer said, I want to do it the day before closing. Buyer specified that the seller should give them access. Buyer has the right. What if the seller's not out yet? Buyer still has the right. It's not the smart thing to do. Why would you want to inspect the property that isn't completely emptied yet? The seller doesn't have to be out until the closing date. The buyer has to be able to do a walkthrough. Now we start getting into the back and forth of everything. What did we say yesterday? Be kind, be kind, be kind. So then we get into that. So the buyer gets to specify when they do their walkthrough. The seller doesn't get to tell them no, but also if the seller's not out yet, does your buyer really want to walk through a property that's not completely vacant yet? They can't force the seller out, but the seller also can't say no. So what do we end up with? That's where we come involved. That's where we start discussing, talking, negotiating, being kind, communicating. That's where communication is absolutely key. But then there's also other verbiage. Oh, line 508. Access to property to conduct appraisals, inspections, and walkthrough. Seller shall, upon reasonable notice, provide utility services and access to the property for appraisals and inspections, including a walkthrough or follow-up walkthrough if necessary prior to closing. Reasonable notice. Reasonable notice. What's reasonable? Exactly. Reasonable. Seller doesn't think 1 week was reasonable notice. Okay, who determines reasonable? Judges and attorneys. You don't want to get to that point. So let's discuss, let's communicate, let's be kind, let's get through this together. And then let's say we have disputes. All of this stuff happens. We have disputes. Let's talk about dispute resolution. And what this will be the last thing we cover. Unresolved controversies, claims, and other matters in question between buyer and seller arising out of or relating to this contract or its breach, enforcement, or interpretation will be settled as follows. Buyer and seller will have 10 days after the date the conflicting demands for the deposit are made to attempt to resolve such a dispute, failing which buyer and seller shall submit such dispute to mediation under paragraph 16B, right here, right below it. Guess what it doesn't say? I'm going to sue you. If you don't do this, I'm going to sue you. No, this actually has to happen first before you decide you want to sue me. And then after you decide to sue me, or after you decide you want to sue me, we're going to go through mediation. The mediation is going to say, this is what happens. Now you're going to sue me after the mediator decided. And now a judge is going to see that a mediator already said this, and you're trying to sue me for more. And you think, why do you think you deserve more? This doesn't seem like it's right. So it's going to be some longer processes. But it says you have 10 days after the conflict, the conflicting demands between the buyer and seller to work it out and figure it out. And if you can't figure it out in 10 days, you submit for mediation. And a buyer and seller shall attempt to settle disputes in an amicable manner through mediation pursuant to Florida rules and certified and court-appointed mediators. The mediator must be certified and have experience in real estate. Injunctive relief may be sought without first complying this paragraph. Disputes not settled pursuant to this paragraph may be resolved by instituting action in the appropriate court having jurisdiction in this matter. This paragraph shall survive closing or termination. This is what you're supposed to go through. Everybody jumps to, I'm going to sue you. It's not what happens. It says you sign an agreement saying that we have 10 days to work it out ourselves. If we can't, then we go to mediation. Simple. There is one more chat. I have a question. If there are no utilities turned on and it's an as-is contract, is the seller legally required to turn them on? Yes. It says he will provide access to the property. Let's go back to that. 508 to 510. It says they will. It says they will provide them. It says, shall upon reasonable notice provide utilities, services, and access. The seller has to. It says the seller shall upon reasonable notice. Why do some banks use their own contracts or have their own addenda? Because their addendum will supersede the terms of the contract, and their addendum a lot of times says that utilities will not be provided. So they put something in there that says the seller doesn't have to provide utilities sometimes, and it's as is. So I've shown many listings where they would not, and sometimes the buyer turns it on for a day to do inspections. You can, but here's the issue. There's no utilities. The seller says they won't do it. If it's a bank property, there's usually an addendum stating that they don't have to. They have something in there typically clarifying that. But if your buyer turns on water to the property for utilities to check things, what happens if the water damages the property? You have an inspection period. As is, I have the right to perform any and all inspections I want. And if my inspections damage the property, the buyer is responsible for bringing it back to its previous use, previous condition. If I turn the water on and I turned it on, what says in here that the seller is responsible because it's his house? What says I'm not responsible because I'm the one that turned it on? Should you get something in writing saying the seller allowed me to do this and takes all responsibility for any damage? Probably, but that's not covered by the contract. So I don't think it's always the greatest idea to do that. And it says in the contract, the seller is supposed to provide them. If we were to represent someone who did not have utilities on and did not wish to turn them on, should that be included as additional terms? Absolutely. Seller will cross through that line of the contract that says the seller shall provide utilities. Just cross through it. clarified in additional terms. Seller should not be providing utilities, but it'll be buyer's responsibilities to turn utilities on, or buyer will not be able to turn utilities on prior to closing. All right, guys, 9:30 Wednesday, October 5th. You guys have an awesome Wednesday. We will talk with you soon.